have made it to the end of an amazing day, and we're capping it off with an amazing guest that is known to many of us in this room, but it's my sincere pleasure to announce him. And the first time I met him, I called him Byron, so that is not how you pronounce his name. It is Bryon. We were on a podcast not too long ago, and I got to hear his story for the first time. So deep roots in the WeWork space, not this particular one, but a different WeWork space, and how that kind of helped to open up and facilitate innovation. So if you are of a mind that you think that space doesn't matter, it does. Bryon was one of the founding members of Kessel Run, and kind of saw some great opportunities there, worked as the chief operating officer at Kessel Run for 2 years, and surprise, got a little frustrated at how the Defense Department was looking at authorization to operate, or ATO, and continuous ATO. So he has picked the lock on that, and we'll tell us a little bit about that story, but based on kind of what he's learned and what he's seen around the Defense Department, he actually started his own business in 2019 at Rise 8, and is here now as the CEO of Rise 8 to share with us today. So please welcome Bryon Kroger.
Thank you. Yeah, today's fun fact, since we're going to talk about continuous ATO, it's actually the 4-year anniversary of the first continuous ATO getting signed this month. So it was April 18th of 2018, and so it's also the 3-year anniversary of me leaving Kessel Run and the 2-year anniversary of me hiring my first employee. So we're at 45 people now. It's been a wild ride, and I was asked to talk about ATO, and on the schedule, I apologize, it says how to get an ATO. I could talk a little bit about that, but I'm actually going to do a retrospective. So the first question I have, we'll do a scale of 1 to 3. What's your knowledge of continuous ATO? 1 being like very little or none, 3 being a lot. Who's a 1? All right, who's a 2? Any 3s in the room? Yes. All right, so I'm glad that I decided to also include, prior to the retrospective, a little brief history of continuous ATO, how we got there. But who's familiar with Agile retrospectives at least? All right, so I'm going to do a start, stop, continue, and I'm going to do a wind in our sails. It's not a true retro because I don't really have a workshop format here. It's just going to be like retro out of my head, but it should still be kind of fun. So if you do want to learn more about the nitty-gritty tactics, we do have a video. You can find it on our Rise 8 YouTube channel, and it goes a little bit more in detail. And the other thing I would say, if you're trying to get an ATO, it's actually not as bad as it seems. The thing that keeps people from getting the ATO or continuous ATO is just not doing controls mapping. I'm sorry, but if you want an ATO, you're going to have to map controls. And surprisingly, though, NIST has really good resources. The NIST publications, the way they organize their website, you can go on there and figure out everything that you need to do to get an ATO for your system in the DoD. So one quick thing that I'll mention, some definitions. Authority to operate, hopefully you're familiar, but to deploy your system anywhere in the federal government, you have to follow FSMA, and NIST RMF is kind of the DoD's framework for meeting the FSMA requirement. It was an act passed in 2002, later updated in 2014, for information security requirements for federal systems. So it's pretty actually straightforward to go and get an ATO. You just got to do the hard work. It's monotonous work. It sucks. I don't like it. But we've sat in a room and mapped all the controls for an entire system over the course of a few days. So it can be done, and if you do that, it will make it much easier when you go to deploy your system, whether you're going through an SBIR or a traditional contract vehicle. Just do yourself a favor and do the hard work. Last thing I'll say, in the DoD, since this is DEF, information levels are really important. So if you're working in the cloud, you need to look at DISA's SRG, Security Requirements Guide. And those 2 resources will get you everything you need to know. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I do want to talk about ongoing authorization, which is a provision within NIST. Basically, an ATO normally has a time limit on it. Average is usually 3 years. And there's a provision that allows you to not have to go up for reassessment by continuously doing the RMF process. So it's an ongoing authorization. Continuous ATO is literally a branded term that I made up. Completely made up. I wish I didn't make it up, but I made it up. And it was a branded term for ongoing authorization, specifically the way that we implemented it at Kessel Run. And that has caused a lot of confusion. I don't like it because it puts the emphasis on the ATO instead of what you need to be doing to get and maintain that ATO, which is continuous risk management framework. If you want a continuous ATO and you don't have hand-wavy network of people that can get you a waiver, you are going to have to continuously do RMF. So what we really did at Kessel Run is we shifted RMF left in the development cycle such that it was always running concurrent with development. Since we were doing DevOps and continuous delivery, that meant we were also doing continuous RMF. Devil's in the details there. It's a little easier said than done, but that should give you a good framework for what I'm about to talk about. So a brief history of continuous ATO. I can't start this story without talking about why. So the Agile Manifesto, been around for years, right? DoD says they're doing Agile, but there's zero continuous delivery anywhere in the DoD except for like a couple software factories, not all 19, by the way. I don't even know how we have that number. But if you look at the principles, which people often skip, one of them is our highest priority is to satisfy the customers through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So I like to say, if your delivery is not continuous, then Agile has not manifested. You're not actually doing Agile until you get to that point. The whole point is about feedback loops, and you don't have a feedback loop until you have a loop of getting into prod, getting feedback, and iterating on that. Everything else up until then, you can reduce risk, you can do a lot of things, but like prod is the ultimate arbiter of truth. So you have to get to prod. And there's this problem that we're seeing in the DoD right now. I got these awkward things covering my words, I'm sorry. But senior leaders tend to focus on impacts. This is from Josh Seiden, by the way. He adapted this diagram from the Kellogg Foundation, but they tend to focus on impact. What are the results that things are going to generate? And the JSIDS process, the DoD requirements process, says, all right, we got all these capability need statements, air superiority 2040, right? And then we come up with a list of software specifications to achieve air superiority in 2040. And there's this broken link between, and then we go, of course, plan out all the work with a work breakdown schedule, and then we resource it through the PPBE process that takes 2 years, right? We heard about all that today. But there's this missing focus area, which is we assume that those features that we planned in a room like 5 years ago that we just got money for are actually going to produce something that we can't even predict, which is a war with China. And so that missing focus area is outcomes. So we at Rise 8, we tend to focus here, which is what do people actually do with the features we produce, and how do we iterate on them until they actually produce the impacts on the business, or in our case, the mission. And so those rapid outcomes in prod are the things that help you align this entire system. And the only way to achieve rapid outcomes in prod is continuous ATO in the DoD. So that is why continuous ATO, it is the superpower. It is the thing that unlocks everything else. If you can't continuously deliver your software, you have nothing. You lose. Today, your position on the battlefield is determined by who can learn the fastest. Admiral Richardson said it. It's about the team that can put together the people, the process, and the technology to learn the fastest. That's the team that has the advantage. And so we want to be able to learn quickly, and that requires continuous delivery. So that brings me to continuous delivery. This is Jez Humble's definition. He literally wrote the book on continuous delivery. So he says it's the ability to get changes of any kind into production safely, quickly, and sustainably. Getting rid of the safely and sustainably part, you just have continuous breakage. It's not really a good delivery practice. And people like to overlook that in the innovation community, and it leads to a lot of prod damn it moments. And we want to transition from prod damn it to being able to say prod damn. And Jez gives a really good overview of how they did this at 18F. So we stood on the shoulders of giants at Kessel Run. We didn't just make this up. There's a long lineage leading up to this, but I would say cloud.gov is an interesting one to look into. And they actually recently collaborated with Kessel Run on chaos engineering, which is a great story. So it kind of comes full circle about a month ago. But I recommend checking out this talk, When DevOps Meets Regulation, Integrating Continuous with Government. He says jokingly that shipping software isn't rocket science, but that the federal government has a digital launch checklist that's actually worse than launching satellites into space. And then he goes on to talk about how they built cloud.gov with common controls inheritance to enable faster delivery to prod. They solved a lot of problems around prod-like environments in dev, push-button deployments, and templates for all of that nasty compliance documentation that's part of FISMA. But it still wasn't continuous, it wasn't perfect. And so my team and I at Kessel Run, we really decided to hit the books and see what does NIST actually say? What does the various policies and procedures, what do they actually say? Because I'm a Dan Ward fan too on the ACT side. Dan Ward says ignorance of the FAR is a greater barrier to innovation than the FAR itself. And you could say the exact same thing about RMF. And so we asked the same question that Jez asked: what if you could get valuable software released on demand with higher quality and reduced risk? And the answer is you can. And the barrier actually isn't RMF. So I've got a whole bunch of excerpts here. I'm not going to read through them all, but in this one it talks about the flexibility, and this is in NIST documentation for RMF, right? It says you can even tailor control selection, which is something not enough people take advantage of, by the way. People are like, oh, NIST wasn't written for cloud-based systems. Well, that's great. You can actually tailor your controls, and you should. Use of automation in the execution of RMF. Aligning RMF with the software development lifecycle. And my favorite, they even have a list of tips for streamlining RMF implementation. Again, this isn't like there's a loophole in policy. The policy is literally telling you to go do these things. So we just need to take advantage of that. The problem is that this is the way we've always done it. We have a serial ANA process, assessment and authorization, and unfortunately, it leads to a lot of, I used to call it a culture barrier. More on that in a second, but it really isn't the right way to think about it. NGA, ATO in a day, they took this concept from 18F and they took it a step farther. Instead of just using open source Cloud Foundry, they used Pivotal Cloud Foundry, which is a commercial version. Hot debate on the tech wars and the platform wars as it relates to that topic. But what I can say for certain about Pivotal Cloud Foundry, super opinionated tech stack, incredibly structured. It leaves developers almost no freedom. It's kind of the way that it was built, right? And what that means is that it abstracts not only a lot of technical decisions for developers, but a lot of compliance decisions. It means that developers aren't answering compliance questions about logging, about monitoring, et cetera. So now, if I'm an organization like Kessel Run and I have 20, 30 apps, I'm not repeating not only that technical work over and over again, everybody's reinstituting logging and monitoring, but I also don't have to redo the controls for every single application. I just inherit them from the underlying tech stack. But NGA's process, while it was better, still wasn't continuous. And we found that it was a lack of trust that was driven by a lack of visibility. So they shifted left on security into the development cycle and shifted left on compliance. But at the end, they still tossed it over to this ATO in a day event. So it was ATO in a day, but it was like you went there. It was only once a quarter for us as externals. And then if we had an issue, we got kicked back. We had to wait till the next quarter. And we did get kicked back because they didn't trust us. And so when we were building out Kessel Run's process, we said, why is this happening? And in our user research, and yeah, we applied user research to a user of this process, which is the assessors and the authorizers. It's like a novel concept, right? The users aren't always the devs. Now devs do use this as well, but there are multiple stakeholders here and multiple users. And so in interviewing them, we found they still didn't trust developers, they didn't trust program leadership, and they didn't trust the documentation they were getting from those people, funny enough. And I actually didn't blame them after talking to them, hearing some of the crazy stories about how they were not only left out of the process, but cut out of the process. And so they just weren't included up until the time that people showed up at an ATO in a day event. So you can imagine how that could be problematic. And so we decided we wanted to build a new way where we could trust the process. And one fundamental prerequisite for that is platform. I do want to say platform as a service is a prerequisite for DevOps outcomes in the space. And platform as a service implies something. It's not just Kubernetes. I have a later slide that'll show that. It's an important component of your stack. But platform as a service should go all the way up to your application runtime. Right? Like we want to abstract away as much as possible. And you can see for an organization like Kessel Run, you're abstracting away about 1,300 controls. So that's significant. But then on top of that, we had a software development process where this is for a greenfield application that's going through a discovery and framing sprint or a design sprint. But during this process, they would be introduced to the security process. When they would incept, they would have a security education process. I'm going to talk about ATO documentation and a number of other things. But the bottom line here is we're still doing all of the NIST required items. So yes, we do all the documentation. Some of it's being achieved in different ways, stored in different locations, like storing it in GitLab or GitHub later on. And then we use things like Fortify, Threadfix, or Threadfix to aggregate scan findings, as well as SD Elements, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so SD Elements was this great tool that allowed us to take NIST controls, pre-populated in the system, and push them into the developers' backlogs. This is like really shifting left on compliance, right? And what it also does is creates a traceable identifier that then I can go in and see JA there is actually a guy named Jeremy. He works for me now, but he was a Kessel Run security control assessor representative. And you can see he's having a back and forth with the developer on a control. You can see that there's actually a link to the implementation in source code, which Jeremy, as a SCAR, actually has access to his backlog and his Git repo. And then you can see that it was ultimately signed off by security. And then that's the process, but what about the people and the technology? That's important too. And so what we did is we did industry-trained balanced teams. We actually paired with Pivotal Labs at the time, which was acquired by VMware later on. But we follow a similar model at Rise 8 where we're pairing one-to-one on a balanced team, product management, product design, and product development. And I say that that's really important because we're coming across a lot of engineering shops and they're really struggling in this area for a few reasons, especially in legacy DoD world. An important thing about lean and user-centered design is it produces less code and less code sprawl. And that reduces the amount of code that needs to be maintained, that needs to be assessed, and it reduces attack surfaces. And so don't overlook the role of a balanced team in having cleaner and better and safer code. We use extreme programming, including test-driven development, which also helped get after some of the quality issues that we traditionally see in the DoD. And pairing also has another great benefit, which is, we have a lot of turnover in DoD, especially when we're using military developers, and it helps us share context, reduce turnover churn, and that is a security issue too, right? When you have people that lose context on the code base and they're starting fresh, they make mistakes. And it also ensures two-person integrity, which you can actually enforce through technical means. I do want to highlight something, though. A lot of people talking about continuous ATO erroneously say it's certifying the people in the process. You can't, first of all, it's not certification, it's authorization, and you can't authorize people in processes. You can only authorize systems. So ultimately, what ongoing authorization is saying, I approve this process because I believe it results in authorized systems. Right? It reduces risk significantly enough that I can authorize this system. So the people in the process absolutely play a role, but at the end of the day, you still need to be looking at the system, documenting the system, running scans against the system. We sometimes use this policy math, which just shows all of the things that go in both technical and process to produce developmental testing, operational testing, and ATO requirements. But we can, again, get after all of these problems in verifiable ways. This was the MVP for Kessel Run's path to production. I'm not going to go into it. It's kind of boring. It just leads really nicely into the cATO was signed. Again, 18 April 2018, so it's been 4 years. Lauren Nosenberger, who I'll talk about later, was kind of the hero that jumped on this grenade. But my team and I, we wrote this playbook, built the pipelines, built the process, got it through using the traditional ATO process first, and then asked Lauren to sign the amendment. That's important, right? Because we proved that we could do this over and over again. We're going through this long manual process and they're finding nothing, right? We did it 70 times. I pushed Raven, Marauder, Tanker Planner Toolkit, all these apps pushed 70 some releases and they found no findings. And so we're like, hey, why are we doing this? Can we move to this ongoing authorization? But notice, it doesn't actually say continuous ATO anywhere on here other than this continuous ATO concept brief that we had put in front of her. It says ongoing authorization and it references nothing but NIST. So a retrospective. First one I'm going to do, start, stop, and continue. What are some things that I think we should start doing? Well, we should start doing RMF continuously. The community, especially the continuous ATO community, has gotten away from RMF entirely. In fact, they make memes and jokes about it on LinkedIn, and I think that's completely wrong-headed. It doesn't scale, it doesn't result in DoD-wide reciprocity, and it actually creates a bad name for all of us in the community. You're just not going to get to a point where people abandon RMF. It's required by law, first of all, so it's not just policy, it's law. And it also looks bad, because if you actually go through, and if you've ever done control selection and looked at the controls that they're asking you for, they're actually pretty valuable, as it turns out. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in cybersecurity or information security in general, and they're known things. And it turns out known things lend themselves really well to checklists. And so I actually, while I'm not a checklist person, I'm more on the innovation pioneer side of things. I can see the value of checklists for known things. This isn't discovery and framing. We don't need to find the unknown. It's not extremely uncertain. No, we know, right? And I'm not just talking about scans. I'm talking about the number of times people leave S3 buckets misconfigured, right? There's a control that would identify that for you. And we can actually write that as infrastructure as code and automate a scan that tells us if we've met that control. So I'm not saying we need to go do all these things manually. And I'll talk about why we should keep doing some things there. But ATO documentation, oh my gosh. The number of times I see people saying they're doing continuous ATO and they can't produce any controls mapping for me. So it's just I just want to point out, if you go to AWS Gov, Azure Gov, or GCP Gov, they produce a compliance report. They have a compliance panel, by the way, so compliance is not a dirty word in cloud either. And it produces the IL2, IL4, whatever controls you want. It will tell you a shared responsibility matrix. Here's what AWS is responsible for. Here's what we share. And here's what you're responsible for as a customer. So if you're going to a platform in the DoD to ship your app, they should be providing you with that. Here's what I'm responsible for. Here's what we share. Here's what you're responsible for. And most of them can't do that today. So you probably rolled your eyes when you saw that previous chart, because you've never seen up-to-date documentation. But frankly, I'd be good with just any documentation at all these days. I'm calling bullshit on having a continuous ATO without any controls matrix. Just shouldn't happen. What should we stop doing? Oops. Oh, it didn't build. We should stop doing a bunch of work around pipeline conflation. So, and actually, let me talk about controls mapping really quick. This is a great diagram that shows the difference between when people say oh, I'm using Kubernetes, solving the war. Again, important technology, absolutely critical, very low in the abstraction layer. So if you're trying to do continuous ATO, you're going to need a lot more than Kubernetes. You can do that all at the app layer. And actually, if you're a business out here and you're trying to ship an app to the DoD, that probably makes sense. But if you're an organization trying to ship a whole lot of software, it makes sense to start moving your way up that stack and abstracting that away so you don't have to do it over and over and over again. Pipeline conflation is something we should stop doing. Pipelines are great, don't get me wrong, but they really focus on, I would say, build, release, and deploy, but primarily release. It's all about building quality and security into those processes, and that's what allows you to start shifting left. Everybody talks about shifting left. The only way you shift left is if you make space for it. People don't shift left on things because they don't have time. They don't have energy. When releasing to prod is a dumpster fire, turns out you're not going to spend a bunch of time implementing NIST controls, right? And so you really want to start using automation to free up energy, resources, to shift left into dev, and then even into talent management, how we train up our workforce. SD Elements has great tools built in as well for actually training the workforce to implement these controls. And then that's when you can start moving right, which is an area we never get to. ATO really stops at okay, you can deploy now. But now we can start thinking about how to build into the deploy process and the operate process. And so the last thing I'll say on the pipeline piece is RMF is purposely designed to be technology neutral. So if anybody out there is telling you that you have to use Kubernetes or you have to use some pipeline technology, that's hot garbage. You don't even need to use the cloud. You could get a continuous ATO with the cloud. You can retweet me on that. People don't agree with me, but I believe it. I wouldn't want to do it. So it sounds like a lot of manual work, but it could be done. So then ask for policy change first. Don't do this. Go do the hard things, then ask for policy relief. It just never works. You sound completely, you don't have any credibility if you've never done it before. It's like Ray Dalio says in Principles, you're not believable unless you've done a thing successfully 3 times. If you're going to tell somebody that RMF control is not relevant or doesn't work and you've never actually implemented it, you have 0 credibility. So it sucks. You could probably tell at the outset that it's a problem, but go get your software assessment report, get an ATO, and then ask for it. And the last thing, please stop claiming reciprocity, especially when you're saying we authorize the people in the process. That doesn't scale. Trust doesn't scale that way. And so you need a body of evidence. It goes back to controls mapping and documentation. What should you keep doing, though? Periodic review. This is an area for drastic improvement. We do it today, but I think all the software factories could benefit from continuing once they get their continuous ATO to keep reviewing when they're making changes, especially for greenfield organizations. They built an MVP and then like 7 months later, they still have the same BOE. Like, hey, you put in like 15 integrations and a bunch of new features, so that didn't change your security posture at all. And then 2 more things, continue automating all the things and then improving people, process, and tech involved. I think this goes without saying, but I've been sad to see that since 2018, there hasn't been a big advancement actually in continuous ATO. The technologies used, the processes. In fact, I won't name them, maybe later at the bar if you catch me. There are organizations using Kessel Run's app-level controls, which are based on inheriting Kessel Run's platform controls. But they're not using Kessel Run's platform, they're just using Kubernetes. And so they went from the most opinionated to the least opinionated, and they're still only looking at the same controls. So that just doesn't quite compute. So there's a lot to be done in this space in terms of improving and automating. One last thing I'll say that we need to keep doing, again, this is all about shipping outcomes. We're in Boston, so I thought I should use Kessel Run as one of the largest and highest performing software factories. But if you're going to say that you're doing this too, it better be in prod. So prod is my witness. Kessel Run is doing these things. It's pretty incredible to see. Wind in our sails. I'm going to go through this one really fast, but all the wind as I was trying to build this, I was like, it's all people. This is a people-driven change initiative, and the first one that is worth talking about in getting to this goal of getting changes and features quickly and safely and sustainably into prod is Lauren Nasenberger. She was my hero. I got to share the stage with her once, but she's the one that actually signed the continuous ATO memo when nobody else would. And we did all the things, so like it was safe. But it wasn't safe politically, and she carried that banner and still is carrying that banner, and she's just an incredible, incredible woman. She's a former Kessel runner, but I thought I should put an Army person, and since she's a former Kessel runner, it felt better to me. You can't quite see her face, but that is Angel at Army Software Factory. She's really pushing the ball forward on continuous ATO and somebody worth connecting with. Paul Puckett. He's the director of Army's Executive Cloud Management Agency and is really like one of the best speakers still in government on this topic. Super well-versed, super knowledgeable, and doing great things for building out the Army. Chris Hughes, thought leader in this space. Definitely follow him on LinkedIn if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details. Danny Holtzman, got to talk about the AOs. He was the AO that signed off and continues to sign off on multiple continuous ATOs, including Platform 1. So AOs aren't, we refer to them as the frozen middle, but they're not all frozen. Guy's a thought leader. And then there's an ecosystem of great software companies that can help you. I saw Raft here, you got Rise. There's a whole bunch of people in this ecosystem. And I'm putting this one kind of in between Wind and Anchor because I haven't decided yet, but Continuous ATO Memo Volume 1, Version 1, needs some iteration. So I put V1 up there. Jury's out if version 2 will be better, but I actually think it's more of an anchor today. I'll talk more about that over drinks, but ultimately it pushes the authority from the AO. Any AO in the entire DoD can grant a continuous ATO under ongoing authorization. Now you have to go to the DoD CISO. And they're like, oh no, it's going to be great. They're all friends. And I'm like, have you ever tried to staff something to the DoD CISO? Captain Kroger, when I was a captain at Kessel Run, if I tried to staff something to him, it's going to go through 30 rounds of review at least before they even let me get outside the organization. Toxic negativity and our own champions. If you were at Hondo Gert's talk at DEF a couple of years ago, he talked about good rebels and bad rebels. There's a lot of bad rebels in the ecosystem right now. Some of them have a lot of fans, especially on LinkedIn, but their toxic negativity is actually keeping us from moving forward. The way that they're treating people, the way that they talk to people who don't get cloud, that don't get software, is just not conducive to change management. Because that's what this really is. It's a change aversion problem. It's not a risk aversion problem. So I didn't talk about that earlier, but we're not actually increasing risk. A big pet peeve of mine when we say people should accept more risk. No, you shouldn't. Not in cybersecurity, especially. You should be healthily, keyword, healthily risk averse. But when we start telling people to take more risk in cybersecurity, it's inevitably going to lead to nowhere. And so I like to just point out how the way we're doing business today is actually inherently risky. Right? Granting an ATO and letting it sit for 3 years seems pretty risky. And pointing out how everything that I've talked about today is actually decreasing risk. Even the problems I pointed out in some of the other software factories, still light years ahead of where everything else is in the DoD. And so that's the way to talk to people, not cutting them down. digital thespians or innovation theater is really keeping us from moving forward. There's a lot of people saying or even having continuous ATOs that shouldn't. And when people dig under the hood and they find out what's really going on, it just sets us all back. And it leads to less adoption. All right, risks. A major security incident. We stop improving and our own mindsets and attitudes. This one, I love the talk this morning on design, but really like the egocentricity and not empathizing, particularly with assessors and authorizers, has been a big risk in my mind. We continue to build out the developer experience, and we're not thinking about the assessor and authorizer experience. This is a blue ocean, by the way, if you're a product company. And then the way that we treat people. The only way to effectively create change is through empathy. The highest form of empathy is meeting people where they are and not even asking them to change at all. That's the starting point for the conversation. And then the move from there is really tiny. So again, we didn't jump from nothing to continuous ATO overnight, right? We worked with the people, we did research with them, we found out their pains, we built them solutions, we gave them more transparency, more control than they've ever had. That's how you build a movement. And empathy is key to doing that. So that's all I have. Remember, it's all about outcomes at the end of the day, not continuous ATOs, not platforms. So if you aren't shipping outcomes, none of this matters. Any questions?
Nobody gets another drink unless there are questions asked. So.